Good night. Buenas noches, everyone. I am Bruno Carvalho. I'm interim director of the Mahindra Humanities Center, while Susie Clark is on leave. And it is my pleasure to welcome you all to the first session of Writers Speak of the year. It could not be a better one, with two brilliant literary voices, Alma Guillermoprieto and Valeria Luiselli. I have learned over several cafezinhos, conversations with Alma over the years, that when Alma speaks, listen we must. So my role here will be to be very, very brief and pass the word to our very own Duncan White, who is the convener of this wonderful series. Besides that, Duncan is the associate director of the General Education Program and a lecturer in history and literature. He's an accomplished author himself, more recently of the great Cold Warriors, writers who waged the literary Cold War. So once again, welcome to Writers Speak, Duncan.
So thank you all for being here tonight. Such a beautiful day, beautiful evening. We really appreciate you being here, and we appreciate your understanding with the change of venue. As Bruno so kindly introduced, I'm Duncan White. I convene this series for the Mahindra Humanities Center. It's a great opportunity for us to get writers on campus. It was founded by Claire Massoud in 2019. We pushed through the pandemic, and we continue to have the privilege of having really wonderful writers come and visit us on campus. And today I am just thrilled to be introducing Alma Guillermoprieto and Valeria Luiselli. So Alma's work, as many of you in this room know, really defies summary. She made her name as a fearless reporter in the late 70s and early 80s, covering the Nicaraguan Revolution and the massacre at El Mozote, setting her on a path to becoming one of the foremost journalists and public intellectuals in Latin America. Her essays, many published in the New York Review of Books and the New Yorker, are collected in two indispensable volumes, The Heart That Bleeds and Looking for History. In 2004, she published Dancing with Cuba, a memoir of the 6 months she spent teaching ballet in Cuba. This week, the New York Review of Books, as part of its 60th anniversary edition, published Alma's essay on the early life and work of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I read that this afternoon. It's wonderful. I really urge you all to read that wonderful essay. Her work has won a multitude of awards and honors, and she's currently a distinguished visiting professor at Bard. She now divides her time between Colombia, Mexico, and New York City. But as a former Neiman and Radcliffe Fellow and a long-standing friend of the Mahindra Humanities Center, we hope Harvard will always be something of a home for Alma. In conversation with Alma this evening is the wonderful Valeria Luiselli, the author of 5 books, including most recently Tell Me How It Ends, an essay in 40 questions, and the novel Lost Children Archive. Ranging between genres and modes, Valeria's astonishing work has been translated into more than 20 languages. She even gives Alma a run for her money on the awards front, having won a MacArthur Fellowship and a Carnegie Medal, among many other prizes. Valeria is a visiting professor in the English department here at Harvard, where she also has a residency with the Art Lab, working on a collaborative artwork documenting the soundscape of the Mexico-US borderlands. I would just ask you before we get started to make sure that your cell phones are silenced, and there will be an opportunity to ask questions. When we get to that point, please raise your hands. We have microphones so that everybody in the audience can hear you. So with that, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Alma and Valeria.
Thank you. Thank you for your patience. Well, it's for me a true honor and a pleasure to be speaking with Alma today. I won't reintroduce her, but I'll maybe speak from a more personal perspective. Alma is a real mentor figure for me, and one of the best kind of mentor figures, in the sense that she's not someone who takes you under her wing and then suffocates you with it, testosterone and that kind of thing, but rather someone whose trajectory is so wild and free and mysterious as the planet, not planet Pluto. And then when when her orbit comes closer, there's a warmth and a certainty that you're with someone who knows how to listen like very few people in this planet know how to listen. So I think that as a mentor figure, something that I really appreciate because my generation, as we were growing up, did not have a lot of women to follow because we really still grew up in a world where the women of my generation were reading, as we were growing up, only men. And then there was this figure, Alma Guillermoprieto, who had like the freedom to pursue her own concerns and interests and would do whatever she wanted to do. And she had a gaze that was sharpened by the razor of compassion and not ego, which was very strange within the journalism world. I know I'm embarrassing you, Alma, but just this is for them. And then something else, which is like the strength or maybe the stubbornness to remain connected to one's work, despite a literary world that belittled women. As soon as women were visible or famous, they were robbed of the possibility of prestige and were immediately considered as commercial or sold off to. And finally, and most importantly, I think Alma is perhaps one of the most well-calibrated moral compasses in the world of journalism. And all of this, I think, has been a really important example for a lot of us in the younger generation to follow not in a strict way, but as a blueprint that has to be followed, but rather something to aspire to. What do you think? I know you're going to read soon after your embarrassment passes, but just so that it passes well, I just would like you to answer one question first, which is, what did you do, you think, that allowed you to have this radical freedom in your path?
Can you hear me? Hello, everyone. Hi. How nice to be here. And thank all of you. Thank all of you so very, very much. Old friends, new friends, embarrassers in chief. What did I do? I don't think I did anything. I think freedom is granted to outcasts. It's not something that you can actually purchase for yourself. So I think it was just a way of finding a way in the world because no way had been set for me. And it was a while before I realized that that was a gift. And a huge one, yeah, absolutely. Comes at a price. Definitely comes at a price, but what a life, huh? 74 years of it. Hasn't been bad.
I know that you're going to read from Dancing with Cuba, which is one of my favorite books of yours, strangely written in Spanish and not English, because we'll talk about this later, but Alma has mostly written, I wouldn't say in her second language, but in her other language.
In my other language, yeah.
Which is English. And we often end up in situations where we're interviewed at the same time, and the question is, why are you writing in English? Or more like, why are you writing in English? Right? But I'm gonna let you read, Alma, and I'm very interested in asking you about your origins in dance and the way that later led to writing.
Yeah, just on this question of why there happened to be two of us writing in a language that theoretically is not our own. It is very bizarre. The two of us are Mexicans. The two of us have troubled or conflicted relationship with the countries that we were born in. And the two of us have ended up making this choice, and that is a choice, to write in English and primarily, but also to write in Spanish, because you have not given up on writing in Spanish, and neither have I at all. I do a lot of stuff in Spanish that never comes into English. I wrote this book in Spanish. I wrote it in Spanish for political reasons, I'll say. We can talk a bit about that, what goes into the decision to write in one language or another. I was 20 years old. I was a dancer, not a hugely successful one by any means. Merce Cunningham suggested that there was a teaching job in Cuba that might interest me. And I, largely because of heartbreak, said, sure, why not? And so the main criticism I've received of this book is that I really am incredibly nasty to the woman who was my boss at the Cuban National Art School. And it's a legitimate criticism. I meant it to be sort of exaggerated so that she came across as a kind of mean and nasty figure beyond what, and my incapacity to understand her would also be reflected, but I didn't do that successfully. So she starts this section, and it's about 8 minutes long, I guess. And it's my first day at the Cuban National Arts School's School of Contemporary Dance, where I am to teach a group of students, some of whom are older than I am, 21, 22, and the youngest of whom is 16. So, as Elfrida was introducing the students to me one by one, I took a closer look at their bodies, which would be the new material of our work together. They didn't have what I was used to thinking of as dancers' bodies, but they were a unique and beautiful collection of people. One chocolate-colored girl had legs so long they seemed to emerge from beneath her rib cage. She was named Carmen, in homage to Cuba's most popular virgin. Only one student, Roberto, was taller and blacker than she was, but he didn't have the same stiff look. The long muscles sculpted across his body suggested back-breaking physical labor, and indeed, I later learned that he had been brought up in a family of stevedores and was used to hard work. Another girl, Antonia, was very serious with porcelain skin and straight blonde hair, not very tall, but with long bones. There was a boy, Jose, with cinnamon-colored skin and classical proportions, and next to him, a boy of medium height with a long torso, broad shoulders, and the pronounced facial features of a Spaniard. His name was Manolo, the classic name for the son of Spaniards, which indeed he was. Isabel, a girl with a profile of a cameo, also looked very Spanish and had something in her expression that bespoke great efficiency. Then came a girl named Pilar, who was very overweight, with hair black as ink and skin white as paper. And finally, a mulatto boy who struck me as the most beautiful of them all. He was named Orlando, and though he didn't look it, he was the group's youngest member, barely 16 years old. Jose, he of the cinnamon-colored skin, broke the rapt contemplation in which all of us were absorbed. At a signal from Elfrida, he made a short welcome speech. I don't remember exactly how I responded, but I know I was awkward. It didn't occur to me to express my joy at being in Cuba or to thank Elfrida Mahler for having brought me, but I did ask the students not to form a line from now on when they saw me come in. Elfrida's smile tightened a notch. I had decided that in order to give them, and above all me, a greater feeling of security, we would begin by covering the terrain that was most familiar to us all. For this first class, we would work on the technique of Martha Graham. I imagined I spoke to them about what I thought they could find in the technique with its long and inventive series of codified exercises, all based on the vital movement of the diaphragm as it takes in and expels air, I suppose I must have told them about myself and how I spent several years learning Graham technique, first in Mexico, then in New York. I don't know if I told them that the class we were about to embark on was the first I had ever taught in my life. But at last, because there was no other way to postpone the beginning, we began. The first Mass of the morning must give priests the same transcendent satisfaction that we dancers feel at the start of the day's class. The teacher arrives, stands before the dancers, looks them over to make sure they are ready, gives a brief nod, and then with an "and one," gives the opening count. At that moment, the world falls into place. The sun rises each day, the earth rotates on its axis, the herds graze in the meadows, and we do the breathings in 4 counts, first without the head lift and then with, 4 times on each side, followed by a breathing with a spiral in the torso on 3 counts, twice, adding the head on the second round. Non-dancers may think it would drive someone crazy to do exactly the same exercises every day of his or her entire life. But during the years I spent as a dancer, this repetition seemed as inevitable, comforting, and natural as breathing, and never more so than on the morning when, having crossed continents, seas, and cultural abysses to reach that dance studio, I found myself again repeating the movements of the Graham Canon with a group of students who put every ounce of their devotion into each new exertion. It was as if the entire studio had suddenly been flooded with light. The class itself was sweeping me along. Martha's floor sequence is as codified as a section of a ballet class known as the bar. As the class proceeds, the teacher chooses between this or that exercise or canon. The movements already exist, and so does the sequence in which they must be presented. Seated on the floor with our legs crossed, we expanded and contracted our torso, then added flexings and extensions of the leg and the arms to the contraction. Here, I told the students, you have to try to make your legs barely skim the surface as if they were floating, instead of dragging them heavily across the floorboards. With the class underway, I began the process of memorizing the students' bodies. Orlando, the one I found particularly beautiful, looked as if he were built from wooden planks, though his feet were flexible and pointed well. Pilar, the heavy girl, was completely elastic and had the best sense of rhythm in the group. Carmen, with her long, supple legs, was obviously the one who was going to become a dancer, but she had almost no strength. Without muscles in her belly to hold her up, she looked like a marionette about to flip over. In general, all of them were surprisingly weak, except for Manolo and Roberto with their proletarian musculatures. All of them had flaccid abdomens. The students, meanwhile, were examining me in turn. I was taking great care to perform the exercises well, not because I feared their critical scrutiny, but because it was clear that whatever I did would be the law to them from that day forward. If, while talking about the new exercise, I crossed one leg over the other, all of them immediately crossed their legs. If I gave a last little flourish to the movement at the end of a phrase, Antonia and Carmen imitated it exactly. 15 minutes after the class had begun, we were all dripping with sweat. It required no vanity on my part to realize at a glance that Elfrida and Lorna hadn't been the most satisfying role models. Nor did it take much modesty for me to understand that I wasn't earning the admiration of my new students. They had given it to me in advance. For among the many things they lacked were teachers they could admire. Seeing them so enthusiastic and voracious, I wished I could be Mary Hinkson or Yuriko Kimura for them, 2 dancers in Martha's company I particularly admired, and decided that if I imagined as hard as I could that I was Mary or Yuriko, something of their spirit and beautiful technique would show through in my movements. I was actually going to take you through the whole class, and then I decided no.
I was in it.
That's enough.
My daughter just walked in from her ballet class a little late, and I can just see her going like, yeah, exactly. I would like to believe, without stretching the metaphor too much or like forcing it, I would like to believe that there's some passage between writing and dance and writing. And as you know, I wouldn't say also a dancer, but I was a properly failed dancer. I studied under the students of Graham's World, which is the Limon company in New York, and eventually left it for a PhD and for writing, which was, I think, a good choice because I had a very difficult sense of rhythm, and it's very hard to be a dancer if you have to pass rhythm through the brain before it reaches the body consciously through the brain. But there is in dancing, you spoke about sort of the endless repetition. Once you have learned a phrase, which might be equivalent to a sentence that you're writing, you repeat the phrase and fall and trip, but you perfect it with a kind of humility until it's there, right? But there's also just a capacity that you have to have in dance where you listen, but you listen with your entire body because you are in a space with other bodies. And so you have to be very aware of the space you occupy in space amongst others, and a kind of peripheral vision accompanied by a kind of tunnel concentration, right? So there's a lot of those things I think translate, or I feel they translate into fiction writing, or I try to transport them. And I'm really interested in hearing how you went from the dance world and kind of shortly after into journalism, and you took the deep plunge into journalism. You started kind of at the deep end. So how was the transition, and did you feel there were connections between what you were doing in one and the other?
No, I don't feel that, but I get asked the question so often, and then someone actually the other day told me what the connection was, and I said, oh, I have to remember that. But I have forgotten, so I'm afraid I can't tell you. But one thing I do know is that what I miss almost the most about being a dancer is the smell of sweat. I just miss that
Your own
constant animal proximity
to others,
to other people. A proximity that doesn't have to do with emotional intimacy, but that generates intimacy. And I think that kind of intense sensual experience is given to you very few times in life. And I miss it to this day. Also, dancers, we're always very huggy and sort of climbing all over each other like monkeys, And it's just so nice. And why other people don't do it, it's beyond me.
We can make some requests here.
Yes, exactly. Well, for the people seated in the fancy chairs, it's difficult, right? But we can ask everybody else to start clambering, yes. Which reminds me, and I do mention that in the book, when I was a teenager in New York, Living Theater came back from its exile in Europe. And one of the things that they did was that they took all their clothes off and climbed all over the audience. And we were like, oh, wow, that is so daring. Wow. That was one of the key experiences of my teenagehood. What was the question?
No, there was no question. I mean, there's a new question. Okay. You did mention that there were political reasons for you to write this book in Spanish rather than English. I'm curious to hear more.
Yeah, And then you asked about the transition, I know, to journalism. The reason that I don't see a connection between my dancing life and my reporting life is because there was a political split in my life that came with Cuba. I became very radicalized in Cuba and very much a defender of a system that actually, as the fashionable word now has it, oppressed me concretely as an artist and as a dancer. And it was that contradiction that I think maybe gave me a writing spring, you know, an impulse, something to start from, this sense of the inherent contradiction of life, of the world, of politics. How could I live with this idolatry of Fidel, who at the same time was saying that we dancers were comimierdas, you know, shit eaters? How had I fallen into that? When it came time to write the book, and then I want to understand your decisions, which to me are very mysterious, because I so love your work in Spanish, your early work, The History of My Teeth. If any of you have read, and if you haven't read The History of My Teeth, it's just a wonderful book. And it's in Spanish, and it has a freedom and a playfulness.
So now you're going to embarrass me here.
Yes. Oh, I can embarrass plenty of people. If Rachel Codsey were here, and I think she isn't, I would embarrass her too.
She's there,
oh,
she's
well,
there.
Let me embarrass you. There's a great writer.
Oh, I know Rachel.
There's a great writer.
I know Rachel.
So-
I met Rachel in a balcony in New York on New Year's Eve years ago, and I thought, how nice to meet someone who's not boring in this party. Hi, Rachel.
So there's three of us women who are somehow or other misfits and end up writing misfitness in some way, I think. So, History of My Teeth, which is just so fabulous, and the decision to write in Spanish. If I had written this book in English, I would have had to go into things like the Cold War, which I had no interest in at all, and had nothing to do with my experience of Cuba. I did not want to justify, I did not want to explain things in American terms. I wanted to describe my experience at the age of 20 with no political hindsight. And it was hard to do that because then the world that I entered when I went to Central America was completely conditioned by politics and by the tail end of the Cold War. And so it was a conscious decision. It was difficult. It also led to this terrible moment. Garcia Marquez, I wouldn't say he was a friend, but he had started the Foundation for a New Journalism in Cartagena, and I taught the first workshop and then taught a great deal there and was on the board. So I saw a great deal of Garcia Marquez. And he was dying of curiosity, of course, to see how the book was coming, and he really wanted to see how, and he wanted to read the book. And I made the terrible mistake of sending him a first chapter. And he came back and he said, "But your Spanish is dead."
Qué cruel.
Well, yeah, I mean, people in the art world are not gentle.
That generation must have been difficult to grow up
to put up with.
To put up with, no? Like what?
Yeah, but the point is that he was right. I had spent years acquiring an instrument in English, years and years of practice. And to surrender that instrument and try overnight to generate a radically different instrument in a different language, which wasn't my own writing language, that was hard. But I'm still glad I made that decision because I didn't have to go special pleading all over myself and backtracking. about
Don't
politics.
you think that the instruments that you'd gained in English were transportable in Spanish? That, no, I have this, maybe it's a very naive feeling of like, the more one language grows inside our brain because we're maybe reading more, and in a period of our lives, maybe we're more attentive, because that language changes inside us, and so we're more or less capable, depending on the moment we are in our lives, to express clearly or even beautifully. But I have a sense that the unused language is like a jungle of its own that's kind of growing and overgrowing. And then when you go back into it, somehow you're not completely lost. There's something to discover there.
I think that's wonderful, and I think that's true. That's true for me now. But I had to find my way back. And I hope maybe by the third chapter, I wrote the first chapter in English, which is the New York chapter. I had to write that in English. And so then I thought, I will drive myself insane if I keep on doing this. One chapter in English, one sentence in English, another chapter in Spanish. So it took at least a chapter or two before I found that path back. But languages create you as well. So I wonder, in your case, because you've made several decisions that I didn't make, and one of them is to write about the United States, which I have never done.
I was going to ask you about the same thing.
I've written exclusively from and about Latin America, and you made the decision to write within the United States.
It's true.
Why did you do that?
Well, I was going to ask you why you haven't.
Doesn't interest me.
It doesnm interest you. I mean, you are always writing about the United States indirectly, because you are writing about, from Mozote onward, there's almost no Latin American conflict that hasn't been, if not directly orchestrated by the United States, then they have been involved in some way or the other. So you are, I think, always writing also about the United States, and hopefully to an audience that can see what the hemispheric relations are between Latin America, Spanish-speaking Latin America, and the Anglo-North. So I mean, I know you don't write about Alabama or Arizona, which I do maybe, but you do write about the United States.
So why do you? I'm very curious.
I'm trying to
stall for time.
Why do I? Because I feel that I left Latin America too young, and my uprootedness from it is maybe harsher than yours. I left. I grew up in South Korea and in South Africa and in India, and I always went back to Latin America. And I know I feel deeply Mexican, particularly if I watch soccer. That's when I know I'm Mexican. But I don't think anyone does sit and write a sentence thinking I am a Mexican writer writing a sentence, right? That's not the spirit with which one writes, hopefully. But it's harder for me to. I feel with very little gravity sometimes, and it's a deep insecurity and a deep pain for me to not be more rooted in our continent. And I thought that when I wrote my first book in Spanish, that was going to root me in a language and in a city, and that was my very political identity project, to write a book, Papeles Falsos, Sidewalks in English, that was meant to insert me into a language and into a city. But it didn't quite. It's been easier for me to criticize the United States from inside it. I've lived here for 15 years, and to try and find connections between, especially in my nonfiction books. One of the, I think the first time I met you in person, it was in the back room of a very peculiar place in Mexico City called El Covadonga, where people go eat.
No, it's a bar.
It's a bar, but it's a bar. I'm bringing it down. Okay, fine. Where people go drink.
Yes.
But something horrible had just happened in Mexico. The bodies of 72 Central American migrants had just been found after having been disappeared for some time. And you asked a group of writers in a kind of emergency call to come and meet and talk. And I'd like you to talk about that moment. And that moment was kind of life-changing for me, because I think although I had written very well-intentioned but very badly written thesis in philosophy. I studied at the UNAM, as you know, and my thesis was about migration. It was some critique of the theory of justice of John Rawls from the viewpoint of illegal migration. So it was in my radar, my grade, for a long, long time, but I had never really been confronted with the writerly or ethical responsibility to respond to a situation. And that was when you called us and you said, what are we going to do? We are writers, we have something to do. And I want to ask you about the decision to call us and maybe give more context of the 72, because I want to go to other instances that I think you're writing about now.
It was interesting, and it's interesting how you remember it, because actually that evening when we all went and drank at the Covadonga, it's just a reporters' hangout. It's a Mexican daily reporters' hangout after they put away the story for the day. That was the last meeting, not the first. What happened is when I found out about the 72 migrants, I did talk about that once before here at Radcliffe. Some of you may have been there for that. So I'll be very brief, but I was so ashamed, I was so brutally ashamed as a Mexican, you know, a nation of migrants, that Mexicans would then take 72 people off a bus in the middle of nowhere and for no reason shoot them. And I'm part Central American. My mother was from Guatemala. So it was a terribly painful moment. And I decided that what I wanted to do was put up an altar. And I went to the Salvadoran embassy and I bought some flowers and I was going to leave them there. And I thought, no, what is this? And so I together with Guillermo Osorno, created an online altar. And the idea was that it would be a Day of the Dead altar, but that everybody could see just by clicking onto the link. And so that there would be the equivalent of food would be songs, there were musicians, there would be images of migrants, ideally one for each disappeared migrant, but we didn't even know who they were. We still don't know who most of them were, or many of them. And that there would be 72 writers, each one writing about a dead migrant. And since we didn't have the names, I think you chose a number. I just put out a list of numbers and asked people to choose the number, and someone would say, I want to write about number 9. And then they would come back and they said, no, you know, I thought about it, I think I want to write about 14. And then they would choose the number 14. It was all very peculiar and very moving. I don't think it had nearly the reach that I hoped it would have, but for all of us who participated in it, it was very important. And so it nearly killed me, that effort. God, I was teaching in Chicago. Is somebody there? No, nobody's here from that period, but I was teaching there, and I confess, I dropped my classes because I was just 18 hours a day trying to make this whole thing come together. But it was important.
It was a turning point in the kind of the way we saw violence in Mexico, I think, and the way it was...
Or what could be said about it.
Or what could be said about it.
I think, yeah.
I mean, this might be a very general question, but it comes from someone who doesn't... I don't write about war. I've written about violence in other ways, but know, how does one cover war? And what do you think about the word? I was thinking about the question and just posing it very how does one cover war? But then I was thinking about the word cover, which is such a strange word to use when you're thinking about writing, because you're doing the opposite of covering. And so what do you think about that? And also just how does one cover a war?
I actually don't think I ever have, except for the Nicaraguan insurrection.
Yeah.
That was the first one, and I had no idea how to cover a war. And that was my great advantage, was that I knew nothing. And so all of my colleagues who had been in the game forever were like, I was like their pet joke, you know. They taught me about interviews, structuring, and then somebody says, yeah, next we'll teach her about how you file expenses. Right? So I was lucky in that I was very innocent and that I was working very closely with Susan Meiselas, who had the great advantage of she was on expenses, I was not. She had a good room. And she had a car. And so I went with her everywhere. And the way I learned to report was by being a photographer. Not that I took a picture, but I understood that if you weren't there, you didn't get the shot. Shot, another word.
Another word.
So I don't know how to cover wars. I find myself increasingly writing. And it's not what I did, for example, during all the first years at the New Yorker. Now I find myself writing about violence more and more because it's just, I feel inevitable for me.
And can I rephrase a question? And how do you cover violence? I understand it's a very difficult question.
I think there was a moment when I was writing about Medellin in the years when Medellin was this kind of nightmare. And there was a moment when I understood that these teenagers who were doing the killing were actually committing suicide in some way. That what they had access to was death as a form of communication. And I still think that's true. And I think that possibly opens a door for me to not write about gangsters and bad people, but to write about human beings who have been distorted in monstrous ways. But, and there was a MacArthur Fellow whose name I've been trying to recover. He gave a talk. And he worked in Baltimore, and he's a doctor of psychology and trauma. When he realized that all of these little teenage kids who were going around shooting people were themselves victims of post-trauma, what is it, syndrome?
Stress disorder?
Post-trauma stress disorder. And that was a revelation. You know, they have insomnia, they can't concentrate, they have trigger wire tempers, they're paranoid. All the symptoms of PTSD is what I saw in the kids in Medellin, or what I can see today, happening today. So I think those have been 2 points for me that have opened doors for my reporting.
And what about, we speak about violence, but what about disappearance as a form as one of the methodologies of violence in our
that's
continent?
so sneaky of you, Valeria. You want me to write about, talk about what I'm working on now, right?
I don't know what you're working on now.
And what about?
I'm learning from you. It's the journalist way. Sneak a question. I'll give you some honest context and why I'm so interested greedily in hearing you and listening to you speak about disappearance. And that is that it's been my impression from all these years of reading, thinking, and writing about the drug wars in Latin America, and particularly about the passage of migration through Mexico of Central Americans as an ecology of disappearance, where it's very difficult to point to a single actor, but rather there's a frustratingly hazy web of military, government, technicians, bureaucrats, media that cover disappearance in a different way. But that disappearance is not thought of as also a political strategy, I guess, in the USA, where the detention system, I think, has become the great dark box into which people are funneled. So it's a very different, it's a sanitized form of disappearing. It's not the Zetas, and it's not the archipelago of mass graves of Mexico or kidnapped warehouses. But there seems to be, I think there is a line that connects the passage of migration through disappearance also here. So I'm interested in hearing you speak about disappearance as a political strategy. And I would hope that you do tell us a little bit about what you're thinking now in terms of disappearance.
Yeah. Just to go back to this idea of how murder becomes suicide and the kind of mirror. Mexico is a migrant country where migrants in this country are systematically transformed into animals, if you listen to Republicans, and the way that Mexican migrants are treated as they cross the desert.
Don't worry. I can speak in the meantime. What do you want to speak about? Think so?
No, because I think it's important also to note that people are going to have questions. I'm sure people are quite ready to have questions. But you can ask a lot of them to Valeria while I cough. Just to finish by saying thank you so much. That Mexicans killed the Salvadoran and Guatemalan migrants because Mexican migrants get treated like shit. It wasn't despite, it was because. And so this kind of mirroring activity now interests me a great deal. Why does Trump always denounce other people for doing what he's doing? Why do we always hate in others characteristics that we suspect that we have? What this mirror relationship we have with the other interests me, and as a way of writing about violence, it always has. That's what I would say.
Do you want to open it up to Q&A?
I think, yeah. No. Well, I think it's time. No, we have.
So there is this young man, very kindly is going to pass around a microphone. And just remember that please wait until the microphone reaches you, because the Mahindra is recording this event, so they would like us to be clear on the microphone.
Alma, in light of what you just said about the mirroring, I wonder if you experienced violence in your own life. And maybe that's not a fair question, you don't have to answer, but it made me think that you're mirroring in that way too, your interest in violence.
Fortunately not. I haven't been a victim of violence, but the Nicaraguan experience and the Salvadoran experience were certainly brutalizing and frightening, and as near to violence, the death threats were real and imminent. So I did sort of, I'm not sure it applies. It's an interesting question. I'd have to think about it. But my main sensation after that time in my life was I never want to be in that situation again. It's a brutalizing situation. And also how very lucky I am. No.
Hi, Alma. Gracias. After Nicaragua, El Salvador, Colombia, how was for you to write about violence and disappearance in your own country?
Just as the 72 migrants was obscenely enraging and painful to me because it did take place in Mexico. Mexicans did this. I think that writing about disappearances, which is what I'm doing now in Ayotzinapa, is definitely a deeper pain, for sure. And there's some mirroring element in that, Some part of me is in common with the culture of the people who are doing these terrible things. And so there is that, absolutely. It's horrifying. Yeah. And then you go through the editing process and you have to go through the same damn paragraph 125 times. Yeah.
The dancing metaphor does not apply.
No. No, although what I was thinking about the dancing metaphor is how very quickly dancing passes like that, but how many hours go into making that second, and then how this dancing passes that second, and how many hours go into writing the sentence that will try to convey what that second says. It's just a kind of loop-de-loop. Mm-hmm.
You both have found ways to carve a space from which you speak to the American reading public through the New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, published books. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how thinking about that intended reader and the publishers and the process of translating not just languages, but also levels of ignorance and knowledge, how that frames the exercise of writing and covering the events that you write about.
I'll be brief. The first book that I consciously wrote, actually no, not a book, an essay that I consciously wrote thinking about American audiences was Tell Me How It Ends. Before that, I never had a sense of where I was writing to whom. But I was very angry. Tell Me How It Ends is a book, very short essay about the Central American diaspora of minors arriving alone and undocumented in the US and seeking asylum or other forms of relief. And I wrote an essay after a period in which I worked as a volunteer translator for testimonies, children's testimonies, in which we were simply trying to gather enough information to then and translate it into English so that that could pass to a lawyer, and the lawyer could take on the case pro bono, hopefully, and defend them against deportation. And so in that period, I was sort of seeing the crisis very, very close, close to my eyes. And I wrote an essay fearing that it was going to disappear from headlines very soon. And I wanted something more permanent. And it did indeed disappear from headlines very soon. And that was the intention of that book, so that it would circulate a little bit longer, that it would have a bit of a longer life and explain the hemispheric reasons for this diaspora. But what was really interesting was, as many things in life, not something conscious or a decision I really made on my own, but I gave my editors in Mexico in Sexto Piso the English version of the essay, and I asked them to find a translator and a journal to publish it in Spanish. And they read it, and we had a meeting, not in Covadonga, but in another cantina. So a meeting with editors implies in Mexico often 1 mezcal, 2 mezcales, 3 mezcales. By the 4th mezcal, they had convinced me that I was a traitor because I had written this in English. And I ended up signing a serviette saying that I would self-translate into Spanish anything that I dare wrote in the language of the empire. And so I self-translated that essay, although I didn't really want to. But it was a very good thing to be forced to do, because then I had to think wider. And I had to think simultaneously of readership in Mexico and Latin America, primarily Mexico, and the US. And suddenly the essay became a book. It became much more complex and more hemispheric. And I was able to sort of dig into something I didn't want to, which was writing about the desaparición and then the murder of the 72 migrants as also like a pivotal moment in the history of this recent history of migration. But yeah, that's I think what I would say about this particular. It's the only book that I've written with a sense of an audience that then kind of dispersed into something else.
So language is very powerful. And I was wondering whether you ever struggle with kind of finding the right words or even finding the right narrative arc or tropes, especially when writing about violence, in order not to kind of reproduce already existing criminalizing discourses that the state sometimes uses. But writing is putting word after word, and some of those words are more tainted than others. So I'm just wondering whether you've encountered that.
Alma, I'll give you some background. Yeva wrote a wonderful book. She was a paramedic in the border and worked in ambulances and knows a lot about border crossings. So she's asking from there. I'm sorry to put you on the spot, Yeva.
Well, writing is always hard. And it always involves the search for the right word. And searching for the right way to describe the sense of how it feels to take class every morning takes every bit as much effort not to betray that experience as it does to write about migrants, violence against migrants. What you're trying to do is describe something in terms of intelligent emotion, I would say. I think if I started out by writing so that I don't make a mistake, I would get nowhere. I think there's a very behavior-oriented moment that we're living through. And my intention is to misbehave as fully as possible on a page. Yeah, that would be my answer.
I think that's very valuable advice.
Thank you so much. My question is I guess in response or thinking about an essay, Mexico City, 1992, which to me seems to be, in a certain sense, in the tradition, like that long tradition of Mexican essayists speaking about lo mexicano, like from Samuel Ramos to Octavio Paz.
This is something I wrote?
Mexico City. I'm not sure if that was the original title, but it was In the Heart That Bleeds, and it was anthologized in the Mexico Reading.
It's the trash essay. Is that the garbage essay?
It's the one with Juan Gabriel and Garibaldi.
Oh, Mexicanness. Yes, right.
Yeah, so
Sorry, thank you. Yes.
I'm just wondering how, I'm wondering how you would, I guess, characterize your work in relation to that longer tradition of articulating Mexicanness, and what you would say about that tradition, especially in the light of like some of its critics, especially of like Paz and some of those authors nowadays.
Well, there's a wonderful expression in Brazil, in Portuguese, that certain things in Brazil are made para inglês ver, right? And so it means you see from the outside something to show the Englishman, something to show the person who is outside, the tourist, essentially. And what is striking, you've written about this, so what's striking to me is how often what used to be called the third world, then the developing world, then we're now the southern world. I can't remember what our category is.
The global south.
The global south, thank you. How often we are the object of the Englishman's glance, and how we incorporate the Englishman's glance into our own vision of ourselves. So there was a lot of conscious kind of tongue-in-cheek talk about Mexicanness in that essay I wrote about the free trade agreement about to be signed between Mexico and the United States. And somebody said, "Are you going to write about the free trade agreement?" And I said, "What?" And this was my way of writing about the free trade agreement, was this terrible fear that people had that they would lose their Mexicanness. And so what is Mexicanness? So I wasn't really aware of writing within a tradition, but you're right. There is that long tradition of para inglês ver. I'm just trying to figure out if that glance, if that foreign glance, it turns things that could be, for example, deeply personal ritual, like the Day of the Dead altars, into something that gets incorporated into a James Bond movie with a Day of the Dead parade at the beginning, which never existed and exists today since that movie opened, every single year down the Reforma. To me, that's kind of the ultimate translation, mirroring of how the foreigner sees us, which suddenly becomes how we see ourselves. Am I critical of the tradition that I happen to stumble into? Me da igual. No.
Thank you so much. So Alma, back to sweat and dancing, but not necessarily straying from violence. There's a great verse from 1930 in Noites Cariocas, Rio Nights, which is onde perfume vira cheiro, where perfume becomes scent or odor or smell. Would you, given the moods evoked here, I would love to hear you on how you reflect back on Samba.
Samba. God, I haven't thought about that book in ages, and then very recently, like 2 weeks ago, I did, because my French publisher said that he would like to do it. And my first thought was, how would it be read today? Is it exoticizing, even though it was such a conscious effort to not exoticize? And honestly, I don't know because I'm not the one reading the book. But would I recommend it to people? It's never been translated into Portuguese. But the fact that it might be offensive to people in Brazil who are in the publishing world, me da igual. But I would wonder very much if the favela communities would read it and find it offensive. Particularly because Carnival, this is a book about how Carnival is constructed over a period of 9 months every year. And I chose a particular favela to go and be in every day and then move into and live there. And I wonder how much of that offense would be the shame of being looked at by the outside, how much of it would be my own exoticizing, how much it would be, especially with Carnival, it's so much about, one of the things I love about Carnival is the way that people dress up as queens and princesses and all this stuff. And it's like, aren't I beautiful? And having done so myself, having dressed up, in my case, the wing that invited me to join dressed up as maids. So all of this becomes fraught, right? Why was there a wing of Carnival paraders who chose to dress up as servants? And why were those servants dressed in pink miniskirts with a green satin bow? You can imagine the reaction there would be today to all of this. Because my wing said, we're all servants, so why not dress like the servants we are? And then they invited me to join, and I said, sure. Couldn't have thought of anything better. But all of that becomes very fraught today. That doesn't mean that there won't come a time when it will be read yet again differently. Does it mean that there will always be a time when it will not be read in Brazil? I suspect so. But it's something to think about when you write from the outside, or even when you write, when you write from the inside too. What is the readership like? Absolutely. It was a book that was taught for performance art quite a bit. I don't think it's taught now. Yeah. One more? Yeah.
Thank you for the wonderful speech. I have 2 questions. One is response to, at the beginning, you were talking about radical freedom and how it comes at a price. So what specifically is the price that you sacrificed? And then second,
what comes as a price?
Price of radical freedom that you embraced.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank
And then
you. I really wanted to ask that follow-up.
and then I have another follow-up question about the mirroring. Like, how do you think writing in media and writing in fiction, portray the way they portray a certain nation or culture, have the play a certain effect and being the mirror to reflect a certain cultural identity and present it to the world and to other nations?
Wow. I'll answer as briefly as possible one question, and then I'll leave the second part to you. But I know we really are running over time now. But just very briefly, the price. I'll just talk about the money involved, for example, since we're talking about a price. I don't have a salary. I don't have health insurance. With the collapse of the magazine industry, I don't really make a living. And I'm privileged in that I happen to have 2 magazines at my disposal, the New York Review of Books and the New Yorker, that will pretty much always want something from me, and most reporters don't have that luxury. But the price, the economic price one pays for radical freedom is steep. And it's a decision. A lot of my colleagues in my generation particularly did not make that decision consciously. And they're now working as PR people for small firms, or it's been a hard life for long form nonfiction narrative, and also a hard life for daily reporters. It's really been a blow. So that's one of the prices. And the other is the unpredictability of life. Every single day I kind of wake up saying, well, what am I doing with the rest of my life? And what am I worth? You know, what do I do now that is the thing that I should be doing in order to consider myself a valuable human being? If you have an everyday job, you don't go through that process quite so often, I think.
I think that's a great place to end. Thank you so much, Alma, for your presence here.
Thank you, Valeria, and thank all of you. Yeah.